The world was dark and cruel. Every tree looked sharp like a blade. The ground was broken and full of holes. The sky was heavy and red as if burning. Mark opened his eyes and pain rushed through him. His body was covered in cuts and his breath was hard. He tried to rise, but the ground pulled him down. Every step was like fire on his legs. He had fallen from the sky in a broken ship. Now the ship was gone, and smoke filled the air. The Deathworld was alive and watching him. Every shadow felt like eyes waiting for his fall. He heard a sound in the distance, a growl low and long, the sound of a predator that was hungry. He picked up a broken stick and held it tight. It was no weapon, but it was all he had. The growl came closer. He turned and saw the shape of a beast. Its body was tall and thin with long jaws. The eyes were yellow like flame in the dark. It leapt at him with speed. Mark swung the stick with all his strength. The stick broke in his hand. The beast pushed him down, and his heart raced. This was the end, he thought. But then a flash of light cut through the air. A spear flew and hit the beast. The monster cried out and fell. Mark turned and saw someone standing there. It was a woman, not human, but alien. Her skin was pale like the moon, her eyes bright green like leaves after rain. She held another spear and pointed it at the dead beast. She walked to Mark and looked at him without fear. She spoke in a voice soft and steady. Her words were strange, but he felt their meaning. She was asking if he was alive. He nodded slowly and fell to the ground again. His strength was gone, but her hands reached out and lifted him. She was strong and calm in the storm around them. She carried him to a cave hidden in stone. Inside the cave, there was fire already burning. The flames made the shadows dance on the walls. She made him drink water from a clay bowl. It was cool and sweet. He felt life return to him slowly. For the first time since the crash, Mark felt safe. But his eyes still watched her with caution. Who was she? Why had she saved him? What did she want? Her name he did not know yet, but her presence was powerful. She moved with silence like the wind. Every gesture was simple, but filled with purpose. He looked outside the cave. The Deathworld roared with storms and creatures. This planet was alive and it hated the weak, but the woman lived here. She had the knowledge to survive, and she had chosen to keep him alive too. Mark closed his eyes, but sleep did not come easy. He thought of the ship. He thought of his mission. He thought of the man who had been with him on the ship. David. Where was he now, alive or dead in the endless dark? Mark did not know, but one truth burned inside him. He could not survive this world alone. He would need her, and maybe she would need him too. Outside, the wind screamed like 1,000 voices. The Deathworld was watching, waiting for its chance to strike again, and deep in the storm another pair of eyes watched the cave. David was alive, and he had seen the bond begin. The triangle was born, but only one would walk away in the end. The morning came with red light in the sky. The Deathworld did not rest, and the air was heavy. Mark woke inside the cave and his body still hurt, but the woman was already moving like a shadow. She prepared tools and sharpened her spears with stones. She looked calm, as if this deadly land was her home. Mark tried to stand, and his legs shook, but he forced himself. He would not look weak before her. She turned and gave him a piece of dry fruit. The taste was bitter, but it gave him strength. He wanted to speak, but she shook her head. Words were not needed now, only action mattered. Outside the cave, the jungle waited with hunger. The trees twisted in strange shapes like claws reaching. The ground was alive with roots that moved slowly. The air was full of screams of creatures hidden in the dark. She walked ahead, and he followed close. She moved with silent steps, as if the forest was her friend. Mark felt fear, but also wonder. This world was trying to kill him, yet she walked like it belonged to her. Her eyes shone like green fire in the shadows, and each time she looked back at him, he felt something stir inside. They crossed a river filled with dark water. He almost slipped, but she caught his hand. Her grip was strong, and her touch burned inside his chest. For a moment, their eyes locked. The world fell quiet. Then she pulled him forward without a word. But Mark could not forget the feeling. By Noon they reached a tall cliff. From here he could see endless land mountains, breathing smoke, jungles twisting with danger, and skies full of black wings circling. It was a death world, but also alive and powerful. He whispered to himself that no human should live here, yet she was alive, and more than alive, she was strong. He felt small, but he also felt hope. If she could survive, then maybe he could too. Suddenly, a sound came from behind the rocks. A shadow moved, and Mark tensed. A figure stepped out, and it was David. His clothes were torn, but his eyes burned with fire. He smiled, but it was not the smile of a friend. It was the smile of someone who had seen too much. Mark felt a chill in his chest. David was alive, but something in him had changed. David looked at the woman, and his eyes softened. He bowed his head slightly and spoke her name. Mark still did not know her name, but David did. He felt a sharp sting in his heart. Had David met her before? Had David already gained her trust? The woman said nothing, but her gaze shifted between the two men. Mark felt tension rise like a blade pressing on his neck. David laughed and told Mark he looked weak. He said only the strong would survive here. He said the woman would need a man who could protect her, not a broken soldier who could barely walk. Mark clenched his fists, but stayed silent. He had no strength for a fight, not yet. But his eyes locked on David with quiet fire. The woman raised her hand and silenced both. She led them deeper into the jungle. Now they walked as three, but the space between them was heavy. Every step felt like a test. Mark wanted to stay close to her. David wanted the same. The jungle was dangerous, but the true danger was the growing storm inside their hearts. As night fell, they made camp near a pool of glowing water. The woman gathered herbs and healed Mark's wounds. Her hands moved gentle over his skin. David watched in silence, his jaw tight. Mark felt warmth in her touch, but also guilt. He knew David's eyes were burning with envy. The triangle had no words, but it was alive. It grew stronger with every breath. Later, David pulled Mark aside, his voice low and sharp like a knife. He said he saw the way Mark looked at her. He said she was not for him. He said only one of them would win her heart, and only one of them would survive this world. Mark stared back, and his chest filled with anger. He wanted to strike David, but he held back. This was not the time, but his mind whispered that soon the time would come. The jungle around them screamed with predators. Strange shapes moved in the darkness. But the real battle was already here between the two men, and the woman stood between them like fire in the storm, her eyes unreadable, her heart a mystery. She gave no answer to either of them, but she knew both wanted her, and she knew that choice would decide life and death. Night stretched long. Mark lay awake by the fire. He heard David's breathing heavy with rage. He saw the woman sitting by the water, her face calm. The death world whispered around them. The air was full of tension and fear, and something more. Something like love, but also like doom. The triangle was tightening. The jungle was watching, and the death world was waiting to see who would fall first. The sun rose heavy over the death world, and the light was red like fire. Mark stood near the camp and felt the weight of the day pressing on him. The woman moved with quiet grace as she gathered herbs and stones. David sharpened a blade he had made from bone and stone. The sound was sharp and steady, and it echoed in Mark's chest. The silence between them was louder than the jungle around them. The woman looked at the two men with eyes that held no answer. Her heart was hidden, but her presence was strong. She showed Mark how to cut fruit from the trees and avoid the poison roots. Her voice was calm and soft, and it gave him strength. David watched every moment, and his eyes burned with envy. His hands tightened on the blade, and his breath grew heavy. Mark could feel the storm building between them, like thunder in the distance. Later, the woman led them deeper into the forest. The air grew thick, and the ground was soft with mud. Strange creatures crawled in the branches above. The shadows twisted, and the sound of growls moved in the distance. Mark followed close, and his body ached, but his will was unbroken. David walked behind with a smile that was not kind. He told Mark to move faster and not slow them down. Mark ignored him, But the fire inside his chest grew hotter. The path turned narrow between cliffs of black stone. The woman walked ahead without fear. Mark followed, but David stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. He pointed to a side path hidden by vines. He said it was a faster way. He said it was the way of hunters, not the way of the weak. Mark felt doubt, but he also felt the challenge in David's eyes. To refuse would be to look small in her eyes, so he nodded and followed David into the hidden path. The air grew colder, and the shadows deeper. The vines closed around them, and the ground turned sharp. Mark felt unease, but David moved with a smile. He whispered that this path would prove who deserved her heart. Mark felt his skin crawl at the words. He wanted to turn back, but David pushed forward. Then came the growl, a sound deep and hungry. From the dark rose a beast larger than any before. Its body was covered in spikes, its mouth full of teeth like blades, its eyes locked on Mark, and it charged. Mark raised his arms, but he had no weapon. David stepped back and watched with a smile. Mark realized the truth. David had led him into the nest of the predator. It was not a faster path, it was a trap. Betrayal cut deeper than the claws of the beast. The creature leapt, and Mark rolled aside. Its claws ripped the stone where he had stood. He grabbed a broken branch and thrust it with all his might. The branch snapped, but it slowed the beast for a breath. Mark ran, but the path was narrow, and there was no escape. The beast roared and lunged again. Mark fell, and the jaws closed near his face. The smell of death filled his lungs, but then a spear flew through the air and struck the beast's side. The woman had come. She had followed their steps when she saw they had vanished. Her eyes blazed with fury as she threw another spear. The beast screamed and turned to her, but she did not flinch. Mark rose with what strength he had and struck the beast again and again. At last it fell, and the jungle grew quiet. The woman turned on David, her eyes cold and filled with fire. She spoke words sharp and fast. In her tongue Mark could not understand, but he felt the meaning. She had seen the betrayal. She had seen the trap. David tried to smile, but his eyes gave him away. He said Mark was weak. He said he was only testing him, but the woman's face showed no trust. She looked at Mark, and her hand touched his shoulder. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes were heavy with sorrow. Mark felt the bond grow stronger between them, but also he felt the danger grow stronger from David. That night the fire burned low. Mark sat close to the woman, and her presence gave him peace. David sat apart, his eyes never leaving them. His jaw was tight and his fists clenched. The triangle had grown darker and sharper. The jungle outside roared, but the true storm was inside the camp. Every glance was heavy with meaning. Every breath was heavy with unspoken war. Mark closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. He thought of the beast. He thought of the betrayal. He thought of the woman's touch and the fire in her eyes. He knew now that David was not only his rival but his enemy. The death world was cruel, but the cruelty of men was greater. The night stretched long and the future was dark, but Mark whispered to himself that he would not fall. He would not let David win. He would not let the death world take his heart away. And in the shadows David whispered his own vow, that he would never surrender her, that only one would live to hold her hand. Deathworld listened, and the jungle stirred. The triangle had turned into a blade, and soon it would cut. The sky turned black before the sun could fall. The Deathworld was alive with rage, and the air burned with heat. Mark stood outside the cave and saw red light breaking through the clouds. The woman looked at the sky with fear for the first time. David smiled as if the storm was his ally. The ground shook under their feet, and the trees bent like they would break. The air carried the smell of fire and ash. The woman spoke quickly in her strange tongue and pointed to the mountains. She said danger was coming, greater than beasts, greater than hunger. The earth itself was rising against them. Mark felt his chest grow heavy as the ground split and fire rose from below. Rivers of molten stone crawled down the cliffs. The jungle screamed as creatures ran in every direction. The death world was not just cruel, it was furious. They had to move or be buried. The woman led them through broken paths, her eyes sharp and her steps fast. Mark followed close. Even with pain in his body, David walked behind, his smile gone, his face hard. The air grew hotter, and the storm above broke with thunder. Rain poured, but the drops were heavy with ash and fire. The sky lit up with lightning, and the ground roared. With explosions, Mark stumbled, but the woman caught his arm. Her touch gave him strength, and he pushed forward. David saw this, and rage filled his eyes again. The storm outside matched the storm. Inside his chest he shouted that Mark was weak and unworthy. His voice was lost in the thunder, but his eyes spoke enough. Mark kept silent, but inside his heart burned. The battle between them was no longer hidden. It was written in every glance, in every breath. They reached a clearing where the fire met the rain. The ground hissed and smoke filled the air. The woman raised her spear and shouted for them to fight the beasts that charged from the smoke. Dark shapes with jaws wide and eyes glowing, Mark fought with all he had, striking again and again. Body felt broken, but his will was fire. David fought too, but his eyes never left Mark. It was not the beasts he wanted to kill, it was the man before him. The beasts fell, but the danger did not end. The storm grew stronger, and the ground shook like the world would split open. The woman looked at them both, and her face was torn. She knew what they wanted. She knew the war between them was coming, and she feared that only blood would end it. They climbed higher into the cliffs to escape the fire. Below, the wind screamed, and rocks fell around them. Mark helped the woman climb, but David refused his hand. David shouted that he needed no help, that he would rise on his own. His pride was louder than the storm itself. At the top of the cliff, they found a broken plateau. The land cracked and fire glowed from the cracks. The sky poured black rain, and lightning struck nearby. It was a place of death, but also a place of choice. It was here that the triangle would break. David stepped forward and pointed his blade at Mark. His voice was raw with fury. He said this was the moment. He said only one of them would leave with her. He said the death world itself demanded it. Mark felt the weight of his words, but also the truth in them. This war could not be avoided any longer. The woman cried out and begged them to stop. Her voice was filled with pain and fire. She wanted peace, but peace was gone. The death world had burned it away. Only survival remained, and survival meant choice. Mark raised his hands, ready to fight, not for pride, not for rage, but for her and for life. David raised his blade, ready to kill, not for love, but for possession and victory. The storm above screamed with lightning. The fire below roared with hunger. The death world itself became their arena. Every sound, every shadow waited for the clash. The woman stood between them, tears in her eyes. She knew that her heart would break no matter the end, but she also knew that she could not stop them now. David charged with fury, his blade high. Mark met him with bare hands and burning will. The clash shook the plateau as if the world itself felt their war. The woman screamed their names, but her voice was lost in thunder. Steel met flesh, will met rage. The triangle had turned into battle, and the death world would decide who would live. The storm screamed over the plateau, and the sky burned with red light. The fire below roared, and the ground cracked with every step. Mark faced David, and the woman stood between them. With tears in her eyes, the death world itself had become their judge, and there would be no escape. David raised his blade and shouted that he would win her, or he would die. His voice was broken with rage and hunger. Mark stood steady, his fists clenched, his chest heavy but his will unbroken. He said nothing, but his silence was stronger than any words. The woman begged them to stop, but her voice was drowned by thunder. The storm demanded blood, and the world shook with fury. David charged with wild speed, his blade cutting the air. Mark stepped aside, and the blade missed, but sparks flew from the stone. David struck again, and again, his rage endless. Mark blocked with his arms, and pain filled his body, but he held firm, his heart burning with the fire of survival. Every strike, every step was a battle, not just against David, but against the death world itself. Woman cried out as the two men fought like beasts. Her tears mixed with the black rain, and her heart tore apart. She wanted peace. But there was no peace left. Only the choice between love and death remained. Mark fought with broken strength, but with the power of will. David fought with fury, but his rage blinded him. The ground split and fire rose between them. They leapt over cracks as the plateau shook. Lightning struck near, and the air burned. The Deathworld screamed as if it enjoyed their struggle. The woman held her spear, but she did not move. Her choice would be made not with weapons, but with her heart. David roared and struck hard, pushing Mark to the edge. Mark stumbled, his foot slipping on the cracked stone. The abyss opened below with fire waiting to consume. David smiled, thinking victory was his. He raised the blade for the final strike, but in his rage he stepped too close to the edge. The stone broke under his weight, and he slipped. His blade fell from his hand, and he reached out. His fingers caught the rock, but his body hung over the abyss. Mark could have let him fall. It would have ended the battle. It would have ended the triangle. But in that moment his humanity rose. He grabbed David's arm and pulled with all his strength. David's eyes widened with shock and rage. He shouted that he needed no mercy. But his grip failed and the rock crumbled. With a final cry he fell into the fire below. The Deathworld claimed him, and his voice was lost in the storm silence, followed broken only by the roar of the world. Mark fell to his knees, his body shaking, his chest heaving. The woman rushed to him and held him close, her arms strong, her heart trembling. She looked into his eyes and saw not power, not victory, but humanity. He had fought not to destroy, but to protect, and even when betrayed he had shown mercy. The storm began to fade, the fire cooled. The ground stopped shaking. The Deathworld had taken its price, but it had also given its answer. Only the strong of will could live here. Only the human heart could endure this place of death. The woman touched Mark's face, and her eyes filled with light. She chose him not with words, but with her silence and her closeness. Her choice was not about who was stronger with weapons. It was about who could carry love in a world that knew only hate. Mark held her hand and felt peace for the first time since the crash. He knew the war was over. He knew they had survived together. They walked down from the broken plateau. The jungle still growled and the skies still burned. But they were not alone anymore. Each step was heavy, but also filled with hope. The Deathworld had tried to break them, but had failed. Love had risen from fire and blood. Mark looked at the horizon and whispered that they would live, not because they were stronger than the Deathworld, but because they were human, and humans never surrendered. The woman smiled and the storm passed into quiet. The Deathworld still waited, with claws and teeth, but now it would face them together. The triangle was broken. The battle was over. The story had ended not with pride or rage, but with survival and love. The end.